Let's say you want to create a showstopper painting, something like this piece, which for most of you is probably your favorite piece that I have painted. And many of you have told me, I want to be able to create something like that. You just don't know how to get there. If you want to learn the most important steps to be able to paint a piece like this one, watch this video, because by the end, you're going to know exactly how to set yourself up for success to create a Sargent-inspired portrait just like this one, featuring bold brushwork without sacrificing likeness or realism. And if you want step-by-step help from me to go all the way from habitually working really tightly to being able to create really bold, painterly portraits with great brushwork like this on demand, there's a link down in the description to chat with me one-on-one to see how I can help. In this video, I really want to convey to you the level of attention that's necessary to set myself up for success in a painting like this one, so that you in turn have a really clear idea of what steps you need to take, what steps you need to follow to set yourself up for success in your own work. So the biggest issue that I see is people painting from references that just aren't good enough for the kinds of paintings they want to make. That's why I'm taking my most requested painting here and I'm showing it to you start to finish. Specifically, I'm going to show you how I would reverse engineer it, beginning with the most important step that I'm going to be tackling in today's video, the plan and the reference. All right, diving right in. We have to talk about what you're painting from. I cannot tell you how many times I see artists working from really just the reference photos that are easy to come by. These are pictures that you took on your iPhone, that you snapped in a moment of convenience, or they may just be images that are sentimental. They could also be things that you just found online when looking for inspiration. And these things can be really handy to get you started, but when it comes to creating a painting that's just gonna knock your socks off, it's just not gonna cut it. And I hope that taking you through this journey today is going to really open your eyes as to why that is. So specifically, I want to start off with the reference material that I used to create this kind of painting. And we have to go all the way back to my original photo shoot for this day. Now, I haven't tallied up the total number of photographs that I took that day, but I would be willing to bet that it was well over 1,000. There was also a good amount of planning that went into making this photo shoot happen. So I worked with my subject's mom to pick out a beautiful dress for her to wear. And we looked through a bunch of different options. We picked them based on the materials that I thought would show up really well in a painting. A lot of these were very much John Singer Sargent inspired. So I looked at a lot of the kind of silky, satiny, or lacy materials that I saw in a lot of his paintings, where I just really loved the look of them when it came to getting them onto canvas. We also kind of balanced that with, the mom's taste and what she thought would be flattering on her daughter. And we really just went from there to narrow it down to our top picks. And while it's been a while since this photo shoot actually took place, I want to say that we probably ordered a couple different dresses to try out and wound up sending the ones that just weren't a perfect fit back. So already, before I have even thought about the photo shoot, there's a lot of care and attention that's gone into this. There was a lot of looking at paintings on my end. I'm really considering what, as far as the costuming, would be really flattering. And there was a lot of effort on the commission client's end as well. But it really doesn't stop there either. So I had already been to this client's home. I knew she had a really beautiful space. And my intention was to use a combination of her interior space as well as the exterior space. Now, based on the weather and time of year and the time of day that I was there, we actually wound up sticking to the interior space for this particular photo shoot. Once we got started, I just found that we were on a roll. That being said, I was prepared to be really flexible. I also had some additional tools to help me in that. So I brought a softbox so that I could change up the lighting and experiment a little bit with that. I also made sure that I switched my camera into RAW so that even if I didn't get a perfect image in the moment, I could take it back and put it into Lightroom and tinker with the settings of the image to really get something that was super aesthetic. So here are just a handful of those 1,000 or so images that I took that day. These are the ones where I came back and very quickly, these really came out on top. I knew there was something really special here, either depending on the pose, the expression of the subject, the way that the dress was draping, little details like the gesture of her arm or exactly how she had her hand positioned. All kinds of things led into this final selection of images. Now, one thing that I want to note that I learned from this particular photo shoot is that especially when photographing children or when photographing animals, although this certainly isn't explicit to either of those two subjects, I find that it's really helpful to just take a bunch of pictures and filter them out later. It certainly created a lot of work. I probably spent hours poring over these to really filter through which ones worked and which ones didn't. And I would say there were probably 20 photographs that would not work for every one that made it onto this short list here. So just so you know, not every picture I took looked as good as these. A lot of them were blurry, they were out of focus, they were an awkward pose, everything in between. Now, before we go any further, you might be thinking to yourself, that sounds really overwhelming. Putting together a photo shoot, I don't even know how to work a fancy camera like that, let alone go into a client's home or ask someone for permission for them to be a model for one of my portraits. So my biggest piece of advice about overcoming that hurdle when it comes to photo shoots, because photo shoots are probably the easiest way to see a really substantial breakthrough in the quality of your work, is to just set it up and do it. Worst case scenario, you'll get some photos that are probably much better than what you've been working from, and they're going to be your own. So unlike something that you maybe just find through a Google search or Pinterest, these are images where you will actually have the rights to create a painting from them. Now, even if these photos from your first photo shoot aren't necessarily your dream reference, they're still going to be head and shoulders above what you've been working from before. And it's probably going to teach you a lot along the way too. I say this advice knowing full well that I need to hear this too. I think a lot of painters do, to be honest. I have photo shoot plans with 2 different models that I haven't pulled the trigger on yet because I just haven't solidified exactly what I want the paintings to look like. But I probably won't figure that out without just taking some photos first and trying. Worst case, I come back to the studio with my photo shoot material in hand. I take a look through those photos, I realize what I liked and what I didn't, and I plan a second photo shoot with a much clearer intention for what I need. So again, going back to this photo shoot in particular, I made a plan. I came prepared with my camera charged, my memory card empty and ready to fill up. I had my softbox so I could control the lighting, and I had a couple of different ideas for different shooting locations. I had my camera set to RAW so that I could edit them easily, and I took a ton of pictures. And then all I had to do was go back home and select the best ones. And the great news here is that I didn't even have to go back for a second photo shoot. I had some really incredible ones. And honestly, some of these most incredible photos came from just really natural moments in the photo shoot that were not posed. I've talked about this before on my channel, so if you've watched other videos about the creation of this painting, you might remember me telling the story of how I got this particular reference image. This was when I gave the subject a break. She had done a really great job of sitting up and really posing herself and having a very poised expression, but I found that this kept coming out just a little bit stiffer than I wanted. And I told her to go ahead and take a break, and I did not take my eye off the camera, and I let her just do what she wanted to do. And I found that she was really naturally hitting these beautiful, elegant, organic looking poses. And I just continued to go ahead and, press down on the shutter as she was hitting those. I didn't necessarily tell her I was taking those pictures. This was how I found the images from this photo shoot that felt most authentically like her. So one thing that I would probably do in the future to try and maximize the chances that something like this happened again is that I would probably just talk with the model. If they feel most comfortable posing at first, I might let them go through some poses like that, but I would really look for that sweet spot where they start to relax, and I would encourage a little bit of conversation so that their personality starts to naturally come through. That being said, none of these photographs were straight up perfect right out the gate, so I needed to do some photo editing here. Specifically, when I originally took these pictures back home, I made the decision to simplify the background to remove some distractions. So I needed to go ahead and take that step. I found the easiest way to do this was using something like Photoshop or Procreate after making some basic adjustments in Lightroom to that raw file. I can even practice putting in some painterly strokes at this stage by selectively blurring and smudging the image to see how different edge relationships would actually look together. So oftentimes when I am working off of a photo reference, I will actually work off of a very blurred image where I have just selectively chosen some areas of the painting that can afford to have more sharpness. Now, there is both a science and an art to how to make these decisions, but I think the great news is that when you're at this stage, there's no harm in just trying. You have the digital file, you can always hit undo, so I would encourage you to just experiment to see what happens when you blur certain areas and leave others sharp. That being said, as a general rule with portraiture, I would think about leaving areas in the face a little bit sharper, specifically things like the eyes or highlights on the face. Typically, I will leave the mouth a little bit softer as it suggests that somebody is getting ready to break out into conversation with you. The lips are very mobile. They're the most mobile part of our face. And creating softer edges around the lips really does a lot to evoke that. And then in a painting like this one, I would also probably experiment with leaving maybe a little bit of sharpness around details of the dress, specifically lacy textures. In other dresses, I might leave certain highlights in like a satiny material a little bit sharper. I might also look at details in the furniture or props around the model to see what I like from there. Now, once I have done this, if I like the way the photo looks, all I really need to do now is imagine it painted. If I can do that, if I can look at the photograph and I can already imagine a painted version of it, and there aren't any real changes that need to be made between the photograph and the painting other than just creating brushstrokes, I'm ready to dive in. That being said, if I realize there are any gaps, this is the time to address them. So, looking back over these images now, I actually am filled with ideas. One thing that I want to point out here is that I really was quite faithful to these reference images, or specifically, I was quite faithful to this reference image here. I did work off of it blurred. I did remove this shadow that's on the right side, but I really didn't make any other substantial changes to this image. That being said, because this is such a popular painting, it's also one of my personal favorites that I've ever made, I want to give myself a challenge to tackle this piece again. And I want to take you along on that journey. So today, I not only want to walk you through the steps that I took originally when I set up my plan for this painting, I also want to walk you through what I would do differently this time. So, you might have noticed that this entire time I've had a Pinterest board pulled up on the left-hand side of my screen. This is designed to guide this decision-making and planning process even further. I have a number of John Singer Sargent paintings on here, as well as Anders Zorn, some of my favorite Richard Schmid paintings and other paintings by the Putney painters, some Carolyn Anderson, Alex Venezia, Daniel Keyes. This is a really representative smattering of the artists and the specific paintings that I am most inspired by. But if you followed my channel for some time and you've seen this kind of inspiration board on Pinterest from me before, you might notice that this is a little bit more of a focused version of that. So specifically, I have a lot of paintings on here that are these more classical setups where we have the sitter indoors in a chair wearing a really ornate dress. Now, that certainly isn't all of them. I would say Sargent has the most of these compared to the other artists on my board, but I did want to go ahead and save any other images that I thought simply reminded me of this composition and let that guide some ideas. So right off the bat, one thing that I am seeing is that a lot of these Sargent paintings really do quite a bit to create contrast between the sitter and the background. This is especially true with these dresses that are very light in color. And one thing that I notice when I think about the original painting is that I don't necessarily have that degree of contrast. So one thing that I might want to experiment with right off the bat is artificially dropping the exposure of this particular reference so that the background falls away a little bit closer to what we see in like this Sargent painting or possibly this one. So one thing I'm going to go ahead and do right off the bat is I'm going to go ahead and create a little bit of vignetting because I really don't want anything around the periphery of the image competing with the brightness of her dress. One thing I'm also going to do is I'm going to experiment just a little bit with these different color profiles. So by default, when I pull this into Lightroom, I get Adobe Color, but I can also see the way this was actually encoded in the camera at the time using Camera Standard or Camera Vivid. In my case, I'm really used to seeing this in something closer to the Adobe Color version. When I take this into Camera Standard, which works really well for other cameras that I've used, this just looks really blown out before I've even made any other adjustments. So I think what is probably going to make the most sense, I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna look at Camera Vivid or Adobe Color. I'm gonna go back and look at Adobe Color and then I'm gonna compare it to Adobe Vivid. I think I'm gonna stick with Adobe Vivid as my jumping off point here. I'm going to take the whites down so I can see a little bit more information in the dress without it looking glaring. And I'm also going to make some adjustments in the highlights just to see which one of those I think is more effective. So I think the highlights is actually the one that gives me the effect that I'm looking for. Now to get some of that darkness in the background, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not a Lightroom wizard, I'm not even a Photoshop wizard, but I think this would be a little bit easier to tinker with in Photoshop. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and fire this up in there, and I'm going to see what happens when I select the subject and then I drop the exposure on the background specifically. So now I have this image selected in Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and go to select subject. I'm going to copy that into its own layer. And then just going back to the background. So I'll pull this out so you all can see it. Going back to the background, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to go into image adjustments, and I'm actually going to go to filter, and I'm going to go to camera raw filter. So clearly when I do this adjustment, this looks really, really awkward. So what I need to go ahead and do is I need to get a little bit of this chair. And I'm just using the quick object selection tool in Photoshop. To make sure that I get every part of this here. Let's just see what happens when I drop the brightness on this. So already we can see a difference between these two versions, and then similarly, when I compare this to the Sargent pieces, I can see a little bit more of the connection here. Now I'm going to continue to fiddle with this image until I get something that is maybe a little bit closer. I'm probably going to have to fiddle with this chair a little bit, probably using something like the burn tool to just encourage some of that brightness to drop back a little bit. And specifically, I find that my burn tool works best here when I apply it to the midtones. But I can also create just a little bit more depth by playing with the highlights. I don't know if I like that effect quite as much. Now I feel like I am actually properly close to this outcome. I can also tinker with this to try and get some effects that are closer to some of these high key paintings. What I will probably do for this though is to actually remove my background information and again, just really play in Photoshop with these settings to see what I come up with. So I'm gonna do some tinkering and then let you know what actually wound up working. So in the end, after trying out several different options, here is the edited version that I came away with. As you can see, I've done quite a bit to really help the figure come forward off of the background, as demonstrated by so many of these gorgeous Sargent paintings. I really didn't have to edit the photo too much other than that though. You'll see that it really does look very close to the version that I had in Lightroom. And of course, the Lightroom version wasn't that heavily edited from the original RAW file that came off of my camera. If you would like to see how I actually take this all the way to a finish today, make sure that you stay tuned for an upcoming video where I will be diving in to the next step of this process. In the meantime, if you do want help being able to create paintings like this one, if you want to be able to loosen up your portraits to paint more like John Singer Sargent, this is what I help artists to do every day. I would love to hear from you. So check out that link in the description to find out more, and I will see you in the next one.